The telegram was still in her hand when Joseph Graves looked at her across the dusty platform of Redemption Creek's single railway station, and something in his expression cracked open like dry earth after a long drought. "You are not Clara Beckett," he said. It was not a question. Frances stood with the afternoon sun hammering down on the crown of her head, her traveling bag at her feet, her heart doing something wild and terrible behind her ribs. The telegram was dated 3 weeks prior, sent from St. Louis in a handwriting that was not hers. She had memorized every word of it during the long train ride west, the way a condemned woman memorizes her own sentence. "Clara Beckett," it read, "is pleased to accept the proposal of Mr. Joseph Graves of Redemption Creek, Texas, and will arrive on the 14th of April in the year of our Lord 1883. Today was the 14th of April. She was Frances Beckett, Clara's cousin, and Clara was married to another man in a courthouse in Memphis, had been for 6 weeks already, and had never once thought to send Joseph Graves so much as a word of apology. "My name," Frances said carefully, holding herself very still the way she had learned to do when the ground was shifting under her, "is Frances Beckett." The man on the platform did not move. He was taller than she had imagined, though she had tried hard not to imagine him at all during the journey west. He wore a dark coat despite the heat, a cattleman's hat pushed back on his head, and he had the kind of face that had been out in the sun for years and had come to an honest understanding with it. His jaw was set. His eyes were the particular gray-blue of a sky just before a storm decides what it intends to do. "Frances," he repeated. "Clara's cousin," she said. "I am sorry. I know how this looks. I know it looks like a trap or a deception, or did she send you?" The question was so direct it almost felt like a blow. Frances thought about lying. She had come this far carrying a lie that was not even her own, wearing her cousin's name on a piece of yellow paper, stepping off a train into a life that had never been intended for her. But she found she could not add another layer of untruth to this particular moment. Not with this particular man looking at her with those storm-colored eyes. "No," she said. "She did not send me. She married someone else. I came because there was no one else to come, and because someone had to tell you to your face, and because—" She stopped. "Because why?" Joseph Graves asked. Frances Beckett looked at him across the hot platform of Redemption Creek, Texas, in the year 1883, with $3.40 to her name and nowhere on earth to go back to, and she told him the truth. "Because I had nothing left in St. Louis worth staying for." 3 weeks before Frances stepped off that train, she had been standing in the narrow kitchen of her Aunt Millicent's boarding house on Chestnut Street in St. Louis, listening through the thin wall to the argument that would change everything. She had not meant to eavesdrop. She had been making tea because sleep had abandoned her again, as it did most nights since her father's death the previous autumn, since the sale of the bookshop on Delmer Avenue that had been her whole world since she was 7 years old, since she had moved into her aunt's boarding house with 2 trunks and a broken sort of quiet that she carried around like a weather pattern. "I cannot go," Clara was saying, her voice carrying that particular bright edge it took on when she was trying to sound decisive about something she had already decided. "I have made my choice. Thomas and I are to be married next Saturday. I cannot go to Texas." "Then you must write to him," Frances heard her aunt say. "You must write to this Joseph Graves and tell him the arrangement is finished." "I cannot," Clara said, and Frances heard in those 2 words the specific cowardice of someone who has never once in their life willingly delivered bad news. "He frightens me. The West frightens me. I never truly intended to go, Mama. The advertisement was it was just an idea I had, like a daydream." Frances's hands had gone still around the teacup. "A man," her aunt said slowly, "has purchased a railway ticket in your name. A man has prepared a home. A man is expecting a wife." "Then someone else can be his wife," Clara said, and laughed a little uncomfortably, as though the wrongness of what she was saying had caught up to her slightly, but not enough to change anything. Frances had set down the teacup. She had stood there in the dark kitchen for a long time, listening to the sounds of her aunt and cousin moving through their conversation, and eventually to their beds. And she had thought about her father's bookshop, and the smell of it, and the way she had loved that small, contained, paper-smelling world. And she had thought about how that world was entirely gone now, sold to pay debts, replaced by a narrow room in a boarding house where she was technically a guest and technically a burden and technically a woman of 24 with no prospects and no particular future taking shape in any direction she looked. She had thought about a man in Texas who was expecting someone. She had not thought about it very clearly or very wisely. She would be the first to admit that. But she had thought about it, and by morning she had done something that was either brave or foolish or both those things at once. She had gone to the railway office and used the last of the money her father had left her to purchase a ticket west. She had not told anyone she was going. She had written a brief note to her aunt, left it on the kitchen table, and she had packed her 2 trunks into a hired cart and gone to Union Station and boarded a train with Clara's telegram folded in her coat pocket, carrying not just her own name but someone else's into a country she had never seen. On the train, somewhere in the long stretch of Kansas where the land went flat and enormous, and the sky became something different from the sky she had grown up under, Frances had allowed herself to think about what she was actually doing. She was not pretending to be Clara. She had never intended to pretend to be Clara. She had intended to arrive and explain and apologize on Clara's behalf and see if there was perhaps some arrangement that could be made. Some rational, adult conversation between 2 people facing an awkward circumstance. She had not, if she was being honest with herself, thought very far past that. And now here she was, on a platform in Texas, in the brutal April heat, with a man she had never met looking at her with an expression she could not fully read, and she had just told him the only truth she had. Joseph Graves was quiet for a long time. The station around them was not entirely empty. A man in a leather apron was unloading crates from the freight car. 2 women in calico dresses had collected their parcels and departed. A dog of uncertain heritage was sleeping in a stripe of shade along the station wall with the deep commitment of a creature that had made peace with the afternoon. Joseph Graves picked up Frances's traveling bag. "My wagon is around the side," he said. Frances stared at him. "I beg your pardon. You have traveled a long way," he said. "You look as though you have not slept properly in several days. I have a house with a spare room. We can discuss the situation when you have had a meal and some rest." "Mr. Graves," Frances said carefully, "you understand that I am not, that I cannot simply—" "I understand entirely," he said. "Come." He walked around the side of the station building with her bag, and after a moment, because she had $3.40 and nowhere on earth to go, Frances Beckett picked up her skirt slightly and followed him. The town of Redemption Creek was small but not insubstantial. It had a main street of perhaps 24 buildings, a hotel that appeared to take its own existence seriously, a general store, a telegraph office, a church with a crooked weather vane, and at least 3 establishments that sold whiskey and only whiskey and were not pretending otherwise. The streets were unpaved and the dust moved in the afternoon wind with a kind of lazy purpose. There were horses at almost every hitching post. There were men in wide-brimmed hats having conversations in doorways. There was a smell of horse and dust and something baking somewhere, bread or cornmeal, something warm. Frances sat in the wagon beside Joseph Graves and looked at all of it and thought, "This is real. This is not a story in one of my father's books. This is a real place where real things happen." Joseph drove without speaking, which she was grateful for, because she did not know what she would have said. She was watching the town give way to open land, to grass that was starting to green after the dry months of winter, to low cedar hills in the distance, to a sky that was enormous and bright, and entirely unlike the sky above Chestnut Street. The house was a mile outside of town. It was not large, but it was solid. Built from local limestone, which she would learn later was called caliche, pale cream-colored stone that absorbed the heat of the day and gave it back slowly at night. There was a porch along the front. There was a barn set back to the left. There were several outbuildings she could not identify at this distance. There was a garden space to the right of the house that had been recently turned and was waiting for something to be planted in it. Someone, Frances thought, had prepared this house for a woman. The garden space told her that. The curtains in the windows told her that. The porch with its 2 chairs, one of which was newer than the other, told her that. She felt the guilt of it settle into her chest like a stone. Joseph helped her down from the wagon without ceremony and carried her bag inside. The interior of the house was clean and simply furnished. There was a kitchen with a proper iron stove, a sitting room with a fireplace that still held the ash of the past winter, a table with 4 chairs, a bookshelf against one wall with perhaps 20 volumes on it. She noticed the books immediately, could not help it. "The room at the end of the hall," Joseph said. "There is water in the pitcher. I will see to the horses and then put something together for supper." "You cook," Frances said, and immediately felt foolish for the surprise in her voice. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, not one. "I have been cooking for myself for 11 years, he said. "I am not a poet about it, but I manage." He left her there, and Frances stood in the sitting room of this stranger's house in Texas and breathed in the smell of limestone and cedar and old wood and something that was simply, purely unfamiliar, and she pressed her hands flat against her skirt and told herself to be steady. She looked at the bookshelf. The 20 volumes were an interesting collection. There was a worn Bible which was universal. There was a copy of Robinson Crusoe. There were 2 books on cattle ranching, practical and businesslike. There was a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman that surprised her considerably. There was a Texas statute book. There were several paper-bound novels with gaudy covers. And there, at the end, sitting slightly apart from the others as though it had arrived recently and not yet settled in, was a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch. Frances stared at it. She had read Middlemarch 4 times. It had been in her father's shop. It was the book she had been reading the week he died. She did not touch it. She turned away and went down the hall to the room at the end, and she washed her face and hands in the pitcher water, and she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her own hands for a while, and she thought very carefully about what she was going to do next. What she was not going to do, she decided, was make this worse than it already was. She was going to be honest. She was going to be practical. She was going to offer to help with whatever needed helping with, to earn her keep for a few days while Joseph Graves made other arrangements, and then she was going to figure out what to do with herself, which was the same problem she had been failing to solve for 6 months in St. Louis. At least here, failing to solve it would happen in a new landscape. Supper was beef and potatoes and biscuits that were not elegant but were solid and good, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table with an oil lamp between them and the Texas night coming down outside the windows, and Joseph Graves asked her to tell him about herself. Not about Clara, about herself. Frances found this disorienting enough that she almost told him the truth before she thought better of it, and then told him the truth anyway, because she seemed to have lost the capacity for anything else. She told him about the bookshop, about her father, William Beckett, who had loved books with a sincere and uncomplicated love, and had passed that love to his daughter and nothing much else, since he was not a man who knew how to make money stay in one place. About her mother, who had died of typhoid when Frances was 9. About growing up between the shelves of a shop that smelled of paper and linseed oil and had a particular creak on the 3rd stair. About the last years, when her father's health had declined and she had essentially run the shop herself and loved it, loved the work of it, loved knowing where every single volume was and being able to put the right book into the right pair of hands. She did not tell him about the loneliness. He could probably see that. "And your cousin," Joseph said eventually. He said it without heat, which was almost worse than if he had been angry. Frances set down her fork. "Clara has always been, she acts from impulse, and then the impulse passes and she does not always see the consequences clearly. That is not an excuse. There is no excuse for what she did, and I am sorry for it. I am sorry that you prepared. She stopped and looked at the fresh curtains she could see in the window over the sink and finished the sentence quietly. I am sorry for what you did to prepare and that it came to nothing. Joseph was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The advertisement was my foreman's idea. I want you to know that. I am telling you because I suspect otherwise you have formed a picture of me that involves more sentiment than is accurate." Francis looked at him. "My foreman, Hector Ruiz, placed the advertisement on my behalf," Joseph said. "He decided I had been alone long enough and that I was not going to do anything about it myself, and that he would therefore do something about it himself. He did not tell me until the telegram came back." Francis thought about that. "And then, when the telegram came, what did you think?" Joseph considered the question with the same careful gravity she was beginning to associate with how he did everything. "I thought," he said finally, "that it was not the worst idea anyone had ever had on my behalf." "But you went to the station," Francis said. "I went to the station," he agreed. "You might have ignored the whole thing." "I might have. But you did not." "No," Joseph said, "I did not." The lamp burned between them, and outside the night was enormous and full of the sounds of Texas at night, which were different from any sounds Francis had ever heard. Insects and wind, and somewhere a coyote. And she thought she understood something about why a man might go to a train station to meet a stranger, and not think it the most peculiar thing in the world. The West seemed to require a certain openness to the unexpected. It seemed to demand that a person hold their arrangements loosely. "What will you do," she asked, "with the spare room?" Joseph Graves looked at her steadily. "That," he said, "depends somewhat on what you intend to do." Francis met his gaze. "I have $3.40, she said, "and no home to return to, and I can cook, keep house, keep accounts, teach school if anyone needs a teacher, and I have been told I am an excellent reader of character, though I confess I have just arrived at your house under a false name which somewhat undermines that claim." Joseph said nothing for a moment. Then, "Redemption Creek does not have a teacher." Francis felt something shift in her chest. Something careful and tentative, like a door opening inward that had been shut for a long time. "No. The children learn from whoever is willing. Sometimes that is Reverend Alderman, and his approach is primarily biblical. The families with any means send their children to Abilene eventually. The others make do." "How many children?" Francis asked. "In town and the surrounding spreads. 15, perhaps 18 of schooling age." Francis looked down at her plate. She thought about classrooms and chalk and the particular pleasure of watching a child's face when a thing suddenly makes sense. She had helped her father with the shop since she was old enough to reach the counter, but before that, before the shop had needed her, she had spent 2 years as a teacher's assistant in St. Louis and had found in it something that felt close to a vocation. "Mr. Graves," she said. "Joseph," he said. She looked up. He was watching her with that same careful steadiness, and the lamplight was doing something warm and particular to the angles of his face, and Francis thought he was not at all what she had expected from a man who placed a mail-order bride advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper. Though of course he had not placed it himself. That was Hector's doing. "Joseph," she said, the name unfamiliar in her mouth, like a word in a language she was just beginning to learn. "I would like to propose something." He waited. "Let me stay," she said. Not under any false pretense, not as Clara or as any arrangement that was never really made, but as a woman who needs a roof and has skills that might be useful to a community that needs them. "I can teach the children. I can help with whatever you need help with on the property. I will earn my keep honestly, and I will not pretend to be anything other than what I am." Joseph Graves looked at her for a long moment. The coyote outside cried again, further away now, moving on. "The schoolroom," he said slowly, "is a storage room at the back of the church. Reverend Alderman has been asking for someone to take it in hand for 2 years. "I can take it in hand," Francis said. "You would need a place to live." "The spare room," Francis said carefully. "It is not entirely proper," Joseph said. "No," Francis agreed. It is not entirely proper, but it is entirely practical, and I believe you are a practical man." The corner of his mouth moved again. That not quite smile that she was beginning to map, beginning to understand as one of the ways this man communicated things he was not yet ready to say directly. "I am a practical man," he said. "On that point at least, you read me correctly." They did not shake hands on it, because that was not what you did. But something settled between them at that kitchen table in the lamplight, some quiet agreement, and Frances finished her supper and washed the plates because it seemed the right thing to do, and Joseph dried them because he was a practical man and it was efficient, and they were careful not to stand too close to each other in the small kitchen, both of them very aware of the space the other occupied. The next morning, Frances met Hector Ruiz. He was perhaps 40 years old, brown-skinned and broad-shouldered, with a mustache that was making serious architectural claims on his face and eyes that were perpetually on the edge of amusement. He had worked for Joseph for 7 years and knew the Graves property the way a surgeon knows his own hands, and he looked at Frances across the yard with an expression that was equal parts guilt and relief. "You are not Miss Clara," he said. "No," Frances said, "but you are a Beckett." "I am." He took off his hat. "I am sorry," he said, "for the trouble my meddling has caused." Frances looked at him. "Your meddling," she said, "may have saved my life. It has certainly saved my sanity." "Do not apologize too sincerely." He replaced his hat and the amusement in his eyes moved fully into his face. "Joseph told me you are staying," he said, "to teach. He told you this morning." "He told me at dawn when he came to check on the horses. Joseph tells me most things at dawn when he comes to check on the horses. It is when he thinks." Frances absorbed this. "And what do you think?" she asked. "Of me staying?" Hector Ruiz considered her with those sharp, amused eyes. "I think," he said carefully, "that you are not at all what I imagined when I wrote that advertisement, and I think that may be precisely the point." Frances did not ask him what he meant by that. She was not sure she was ready to know. She spent the morning with Hector learning the lay of the property, which was a cattle operation of about 1,200 acres, modest by Texas standards but well run. Hector employed 3 other men whose names were Tom and Jesper, and a young man of about 20 who was called Red on account of his hair. The horses were good. The cattle were longhorns, rangy and sharp-horned, and Frances gave them a respectful distance. There was a creek at the eastern edge of the property that was currently low, but had clearly been substantial in wetter seasons. Cedar and mesquite along the creek bank gave way to open grassland that rolled gently toward the hills. It was beautiful, Frances thought. She had not expected it to be beautiful. She had expected Texas to be harsh and flat and inhospitable, a place people went to when they had no better options. And it was all of those things, or could be, she suspected. But it was also this enormous sky with its theatrical clouds, this grass starting to catch its green after the winter, these cedar hills going blue in the distance, this creek with its cottonwood trees just beginning to leaf out in the mildest possible yellow-green. "You are looking at it wrong," Hector said from beside her. Frances glanced at him. "I beg your pardon. You are looking at it like a painting," he said. "Something to observe. You have to look at it like something you are inside. Then it makes more sense." Frances turned back to the landscape and tried to do what he was suggesting. To feel herself as a thing that was inside it rather than a thing observing it from outside. The wind was coming from the south, warm and slightly damp, carrying the smell of something green and something else, something she could not name, wild and clean. She thought she understood what he meant. She went to see Reverend Alderman that afternoon. He was a small man with tremendous ears and a genuine pleasure in his vocation that was immediately apparent and rather winning. The storage room at the back of the church was, as Joseph had said, a storage room. It contained 7 pews that had been removed when new ones were installed, 4 broken chairs, a collection of hymnals of varying denomination, 2 wooden crates of unknown contents, and a great deal of dust. Reverend Alderman gave her the key and wished her every success with the evident sincerity of a man who had been hoping someone would take this particular problem off his hands for quite some time. Frances stood in the middle of the dusty room with the key in her hand, and looked at the low windows letting in the afternoon light and the rough plank floor and thought, "I can make something of this." She went back to the ranch and asked Hector if there was a wagon she could use, and if any of the hands had a spare afternoon, because she needed to move some furniture. Hector, who she was rapidly coming to understand as a man who got things done, produced a wagon and 2 hands in an afternoon with very little apparent effort, and by the time the sun was going down, the old pews had been arranged in rows, the broken chairs had been removed, the floor had been swept, the windows had been washed, and the schoolroom looked like something that children might conceivably learn in. Joseph came to look at it that evening. He stood in the doorway and surveyed the room, and Frances stood beside him watching his face. "You did this in one afternoon," he said. "Hector helped," she said. "Hector helped move things," Joseph said. "This," he made a small gesture at the room, "this is arrangement, that is not Hector." Frances felt something warm move through her chest. "I like order," she said. "I grew up in a bookshop, everything has to have a place." Joseph looked at the room a moment longer, then he looked at her. "Where did you get the blackboard?" he said. Frances hesitated. "The general store had a spare piece of painted board," she said carefully. "Mr. Whitfield was very generous." "Mr. Whitfield," Joseph said, "does not give things away. What did you offer him?" "Nothing," Frances said, "except that I would buy all my school supplies from him and direct all my students' families there as well." Joseph looked at her with that particular expression she was beginning to collect, the one that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "You negotiated with Whitfield," he said. "Briefly," Frances said. "In one afternoon." "He is not a difficult man to negotiate with," Frances said. "He is a merchant, he understands value." Joseph was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You ran a bookshop." "Yes." "By yourself, essentially." "For the last 3 years, yes." He nodded as though this explained something. "I will pay for the school supplies," he said. Frances turned to look at him directly. "You do not have to. The town does not have a schoolmaster," he said. "The town needs one. The children on my property alone, Tom has 3, Hector has 2 who spend half their time here." He paused. "I want to pay for the supplies. It is not charity. Think of it as an investment in Redemption Creek." Frances studied him. The evening light was coming through the schoolroom windows at a low angle, and it made the dust motes hang in the air like small, suspended decisions, and it made Joseph Graves look entirely human in a way that was somehow harder to deal with than if he had remained simply a practical stranger. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for coming, even as you came." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and they walked back through the evening together toward the wagon, careful once again about the space between them, about the particular charged quality of that space, which Frances was doing her best to ignore and suspected she was not doing very well. The school opened 11 days after Frances arrived in Redemption Creek. In those 11 days, she sent notices to every family on the surrounding ranches with school-aged children. She sent one through Hector to his own wife, a quiet and formidable woman named Esperanza, who appeared at the ranch 2 days later with her 2 children, and spent an afternoon in the kitchen with Frances talking about education and what her children needed, and who left with, Frances suspected, a considerably revised opinion of Joseph Graves's living situation. Esperanza confirmed this opinion directly 2 days later when she came back, ostensibly to bring eggs but actually, Frances felt, to look more carefully. "He is a good man," Esperanza told Frances in the kitchen in the frank way of a woman who has decided to dispense with the decorative parts of conversation. "I believe that," Frances said. "He has been alone a long time. So I understand." "His wife died," Esperanza said, 8 years ago before we came to work here. Hector says he was different before. Not cold exactly but enclosed, like a house with all the shutters pulled." Francis thought about the copy of Middlemarch sitting slightly apart from the other books on the shelf, as though it had arrived recently and not yet settled in. He opened the shutters somewhat, Esperanza continued, when Hector placed that advertisement. That surprised Hector, that Joseph allowed it. Hector thought Joseph would refuse, but he did not refuse. He just went quiet for a few days and then said nothing more about it, and then the telegram came. She paused, and then you came. And not Clara, Francis said. No, Esperanza agreed. Not Clara, but the right one, perhaps. Francis kept her face very still. You cannot know that after 11 days, she said. Esperanza smiled, which was a considerable event in her generally reserved face. I have known Hector since I was 17 years old, she said. I knew in 3 days. The school opened with 9 children, ranging in age from 6 to 13. Within a week, Francis had 12. The schoolroom in the back of the church was crowded but workable, and Francis had spent 2 evenings painting letters on a strip of cloth that she hung above the windows, and had arranged the seating so that the older children could help the younger ones, which was both practical and, she found, genuinely effective. The older ones learned by teaching, and the younger ones were less frightened by another child than by an adult. She loved it. She had not let herself expect to love it, because expecting things to be good had, over the past year, proved to be a reliable way of being disappointed. But she loved it honestly and completely, the mess and noise and chaos of it, the particular satisfaction of watching a 6-year-old suddenly understand that those marks on a page were sounds, were words, were meaning, were the world made portable. Joseph came to the schoolroom one afternoon 3 weeks into the term. He appeared in the doorway while Francis was in the middle of explaining long division to the 3 oldest children, and she saw him out of the corner of her eye and did not stop explaining, and he stood in the doorway until she had finished and sent the children to work the problems in their slates. Then she went to the door. I am sorry to interrupt, he said. You did not interrupt, she said. Is something wrong? No, he said. He looked past her into the schoolroom where 12 children were bent over their slates in the particular concentrated silence of people who are genuinely trying. They are learning, he said. Yes, Francis said. Tom's daughter, he said, nodding toward a serious-faced girl of about 10 named Margaret. Tom told me she has started reading to her younger brothers in the evening. She did not know how to read a month ago. Francis looked at Margaret, who was working her long division with a ferocity that was remarkable. She is very determined, Francis said. It is because of you, Joseph said. Francis shook her head. It is because of her I just opened the door. Joseph looked at her. You make it sound simple, he said, opening doors. Some doors are simple, Francis said. You just need to know where they are. He was quiet for a moment. Then, there is a dance Saturday evening in the town hall. The families come and there is music, and he stopped, seemed to reconsider something. I thought you might like to see more of Redemption Creek, the people. It is not. It is not the kind of event that requires any particular. It is simply a community event. Francis looked at him. He was not comfortable with this, she could see. This man who was so easy and certain in the management of his property, in the direct conversation of practical things, was not comfortable with this. The slight unevenness in his sentences told her so, the careful way he was not quite looking at her. I would like that, she said. The relief that moved across his face was very brief and he concealed it quickly, but she saw it. I will ask Esperanza if she can stay with you while you, that is, I can drive you in if you, Joseph, Francis said. Yes. Are you asking if I would like to go to the dance with you? A pause. Yes, he said. That is what I am asking. Then yes, Francis said. I would like to go to the dance with you. He nodded once in that same practical, decisive way, and he looked at her for one more moment with those storm-gray eyes, and then he looked back into the classroom at the children working their problems, and something in his face was very quiet and very present, as though he was standing in a place he had been before but did not quite recognize. Saturday, he said. Saturday, she agreed. She went back to her students, and he went back to wherever he was going, and Frances spent the rest of the afternoon teaching arithmetic while some other part of her mind entirely was thinking about Saturday, and what it meant that a practical man had needed 3 tries to ask a simple question. The dance was held on the first Saturday of May, and Redemption Creek turned out for it with the thoroughness of a community that does not have so many opportunities for collective joy that it can afford to waste any of them. Frances wore the best of her 3 dresses, a blue wool that was slightly too warm for May in Texas, but was the most presentable thing she owned. Esperanza, who had arrived at the ranch that afternoon with her children and an unstated but clear intention to help, had somehow produced a piece of white ribbon from somewhere and threaded it through Frances's hair with the efficient tenderness of a woman who performs this service for daughters and treats it as no great occasion. Joseph was waiting with the wagon when she came out of the house, and he looked at her, and then he looked away at the horses, and then he helped her up into the wagon without saying anything, which Frances was coming to understand as his particular way of saying quite a lot. The town hall was lit with lanterns and full of people, and there was a fiddle player and a man with a guitar, and a woman playing something that appeared to be a pump organ of considerable age and uncertain intonation. The music was enthusiastic if not entirely precise, and the dancing was the same, and Frances stood near the door for a while taking it all in, this small, alive, improbable community in the middle of a vast and indifferent landscape, these people who had built something here and kept building it, and came together on a Saturday night to remind each other that they had. She was introduced to perhaps 20 people in the first half hour. She was looked at, assessed, and in most cases apparently accepted, because Redemption Creek was a town that had very little patience for excessive formality and a great deal of practical tolerance for unusual situations, and Frances Beckett, as Joseph Graves's guest, was a situation that most people apparently chose to accept at face value. One person did not. Her name was Dorothy Alderman, and she was the Reverend's wife, and she found Frances near the punch bowl and smiled at her with a warmth that did not quite reach her eyes and said, "We are all so pleased you have settled in, though of course it is not at all how we expected things. The arrangement was rather irregular from the start." Frances smiled back with equal warmth. "Most worthwhile things are irregular from the start," she said. "I find it is the regular ones that disappoint." Dorothy Alderman looked at her with slightly more respect and slightly less warmth. "You are very direct," she said. "I am from a bookshop," Frances said. "We see a great many people. You learn quickly that directness saves time." Dorothy opened her mouth to say something further, but Joseph appeared at Frances's elbow with 2 cups of punch and a look that, while entirely pleasant, suggested that the conversation with Dorothy was perhaps concluding, and Dorothy apparently agreed because she smiled again and drifted away. "Thank you," Frances said quietly. "Dorothy means well," Joseph said. "I know," Frances said. "Most people who cause small discomforts mean well. It does not make the discomfort smaller." "No," he agreed. He handed her the punch. Their fingers touched briefly in the exchange, the briefest contact, barely anything, and they both went slightly still for a moment. And then Frances took the cup and looked at the dance floor where Hector and Esperanza were moving through a quadrille with the easy confidence of people who have been dancing together for 20 years. "Do you dance?" Frances asked. "Inadequately," Joseph said. "I do not need adequacy," Frances said. "I need company." He looked at her, that quiet, present look. Then he took the cups from both of them and set them on the nearest surface and offered her his hand. He had not overstated his dancing. It was not precise or graceful, but he was steady and he kept time and he held her correctly, and as they moved through the figures of the dance, Frances felt something that she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten its name. She felt easy. She felt present, in the particular way that Hector had described looking at the landscape, as a thing inside a moment rather than a thing observing it from a distance. She felt, in the middle of a rough-floored town hall in a small Texas town, with a man she had known for 3 weeks who danced inadequately but steadily, that she was somewhere she had some right to be. The second dance she did not need to ask. He simply held out his hand. The third, they were interrupted by Tom, who had a question about the cattle and who was very apologetic, and Joseph excused himself and went to deal with it, and Frances found herself standing next to Red, who was 19 and had been working the Graves property for a year and was clearly in love with Tom's daughter Margaret, which was a complication Frances had noticed at the schoolroom but which was not yet her problem. "He talks about the school," Red said. Frances looked at him. "Mr. Graves?" "Yes, ma'am. In the mornings when he checks the horses. He talks about what you are doing there and what the children are learning." Red paused, turning his hat in his hands with the uncertain energy of youth. "I never heard him talk much before, about anything that was not the ranch." Frances looked across the room at Joseph, who was standing with Tom and another man, listening rather than talking in the way she had come to recognize as how he absorbed information. "He is a listener," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Red said, "but he is also starting to talk more. I just thought someone should know." Frances looked at Red for a moment. This young man with his red hair and his hat and his earnest, slightly awkward attempt to communicate something he felt was important, and she thought about all the ways a person says a thing without saying it directly, and she thought that perhaps the West was not so different from anywhere else in that regard. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate you telling me." On the way home, the wagon moving through the dark under a sky so full of stars it seemed almost excessive, Frances and Joseph sat beside each other in a quiet that was comfortable in a way that had not been true 3 weeks ago, that had not been possible 3 weeks ago. "I should tell you something," Joseph said after they had been driving long enough that the lights of Redemption Creek were behind them and the stars were above them and there was nothing in any direction but the dark land and the dark sky and the sound of the horses. Frances waited. "My wife's name was Sarah," he said. "She died of a fever in the summer of 1875. We had been married 4 years. She was," he paused, gathered something. "She was a good woman. She was kind and she was brave, and she found this country beautiful in the way it deserves to be found beautiful, which is to say without illusions about how difficult it also is." "I am sorry," Frances said quietly. "I do not say it to ask for sympathy," Joseph said. "I say it because I think you should understand why I let Hector place that advertisement and why I went to the station and why I asked you to stay." Frances listened. "For 8 years," he said, "I have been a man in a house with the shutters pulled. That is Hector's phrase, more or less, and I recognized it as accurate, which is perhaps why I did not object to the advertisement, because I was aware that the shutters had been pulled long enough. Because I was aware that some things were becoming permanent that I did not wish to be permanent." The horses moved through the dark. A night bird called from somewhere in the cedar. "And then you arrived," he said, "wearing a name that was not yours, and you told me the truth, and you negotiated with Whitfield in an afternoon and opened a school in 11 days, and he stopped." "I am not a man who speaks easily about certain things," he said. "I know," Frances said. "I am working toward a point." "I am listening," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I do not want to misrepresent my intentions to you, given that you were misrepresented once already coming here." Frances turned to look at him. His profile was clear against the star-filled sky, the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. "I am not afraid of your intentions," she said. "You should perhaps be prudent," he said, with a trace of something that was almost gentle humor. "Joseph," Frances said. He looked at her. "What is your point?" she asked. The wagon went on through the dark. The night bird called again. "My point," he said, "is that I am aware of what is happening, and I wanted you to be aware that I am aware." Frances was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What is happening?" "I think you know," Joseph said. She thought she did. She thought she had known for at least a week, perhaps longer, perhaps since the dance, perhaps since he had watched her students at their slates with that quiet, present expression, perhaps since he had gone still for a fraction of a second when their fingers touched over a cup of punch. "Yes," she said. "I think I know." They did not say anything more on the subject that night. But the space between them on the wagon seat was different on the way home than it had been on the way to town. Different in the way that a landscape changes after rain, not in its features but in its quality, in what the light does with it, in what it smells like, in how alive it feels. Frances lay awake in the spare room that night listening to the Texas dark and thinking about what it meant to have come somewhere by accident, wearing a lie that was not even her own, and to find that the accident had landed her somewhere more right than anywhere she had deliberately chosen to be. She thought about her father, and about how he had always said that the best books were the ones you did not choose, but that found you somehow, pulled from a shelf by someone who knew better what you needed than you knew yourself. She thought about Hector Ruiz and his advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper. She pressed her face into the pillow, and for the first time in a very long time she smiled. It was a Tuesday in the third week of May when things became complicated. Frances was walking from the schoolroom to the general store to collect the chalk she had ordered through Mr. Whitfield when she saw the man at the telegraph office. He had just come out of it, and he was reading a paper in his hand, and he looked up from it as she passed, and he said her name. Not her cousin's name, her name. Frances Beckett. She stopped. She turned. He was a man of perhaps 35, well-dressed for the West, with a coat that had been expensive once and a hat that was newer. He had sandy hair and a face that was pleasant at first glance and somewhat less pleasant at closer inspection, the kind of face that had learned to arrange itself pleasantly and had not gotten all the way to the eyes. "You do not know me," he said. "My name is Gerald Coates. I am a creditor." Frances felt the cold move through her. "A creditor," she said carefully. "Your father's creditor," he said. "William Beckett owed money when he died. The shop covered most of it, not all of it." "I settled my father's accounts," Frances said, "with Mr. Harrington in St. Louis." "With some of Mr. Harrington's associates, perhaps," Gerald Coates said pleasantly, "but not all. There is an outstanding debt of $230, Miss Beckett, that transferred to you as next of kin, and which I am duly authorized to collect." Frances stood on the main street of Redemption Creek in the morning sunshine and felt the ground shift beneath her in a way that was horribly familiar, the way it had shifted when the bank came for the shop, when the accountant sat her down and showed her the numbers, when she realized that her father's love of books had included a comprehensive love of buying them without always paying for them immediately. "I do not have $230, she said. "No," Gerald Coates agreed. "I know. But you have a position here and an income, presumably, and I am not an unreasonable man. I am prepared to discuss terms." He smiled. The smile stopped at his eyes. "Over supper, perhaps." Frances looked at him. She understood the shape of what he was offering, and it was not a conversation about payment terms. "I will require documentation," she said. "Written documentation of this alleged debt with the original loan instrument and a full accounting. I will not discuss anything without that in hand." Gerald Coates raised an eyebrow. He had not expected this, she could tell. He had expected a woman alone in a strange town to be frightened into compliance. He had not expected a woman who had run a bookshop and negotiated with merchants and was, moreover, genuinely angry. "Of course," he said, still pleasant. "I can produce the documentation. It will take a few days." "Then come back in a few days with the documentation," Frances said. "Good morning, Mr. Coates." She walked to the general store. She bought her chalk. Her hands were steady, which she was grateful for because the rest of her was not. She told Joseph that evening. She told him at the kitchen table over supper, which was the place they seemed to have established for the exchange of important information, and she told him all of it, including the part about her father's debts, which she had not told him before and which she felt some shame about, though she could not have said precisely why, since the debts were not hers and she had never once suggested otherwise. Joseph listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he said, "You believe the debt is real?" "I believe some of it may be real," Frances said. "My father did borrow against the inventory near the end. I knew that. But I dealt with Harrington and his firm, and they represented that I had settled everything. It is possible I was not told about all of it. And this Coates, he is from St. Louis," Frances said, "or was until recently. He has the look of a man who follows women to other cities when he thinks they are alone and frightened. Joseph's jaw set in a particular way she had not seen before. Has he threatened you? Not directly, Frances said. He implied he is careful about it. I see, Joseph said. He was quiet for a moment. I would like to look at whatever documentation he produces. Frances looked at him. You are not required to, Frances, he said. She stopped. I'm not required to, he agreed. I would like to nonetheless. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, this man who had taken in a stranger who arrived with a false name and no money, who had paid for school supplies without ceremony, and asked questions without prying and danced inadequately but steadily, and was currently sitting across from her with his jaw set at a very particular angle that seemed to mean he had made a decision of some kind. Thank you, she said. Stop thanking me, he said, though not unkindly. You keep doing things that warrant it, she said. Then I will keep doing them, he said, and you will get used to it. Gerald Coates came back 3 days later with documents. He came to the schoolroom, which Frances thought was deliberately chosen, because a woman in the middle of her working day with children around her is at a disadvantage, and he was the sort of man who thought about advantages. Joseph was also there. He had appeared at the schoolroom door at the lunch hour without explanation, and he stood at the back of the room with his arms folded, while Frances dismissed the children for their midday break, and when Gerald Coates appeared in the doorway with his documents and his pleasant, careful smile and found Joseph Graves standing in the corner, the smile shifted very slightly. Mr. Graves, Gerald said, I was not aware you would be present. This is a public building, Joseph said pleasantly. Frances took the documents from Gerald Coates and sat down at the teacher's desk and read them carefully. She had her father's head for figures and his eye for print, and she read every line. The debt appeared to be real. A loan of $250 taken out in 1880 against the shop's inventory, from a lending agent named Fitch, who was apparently associated with Gerald Coates. Harrington had not dealt with it because Fitch was not part of the arrangement Frances had settled. The interest had brought it to $230, which was either the correct amount or a slightly convenient one. She could not tell from the documents. She set the papers down. The original loan was to William Beckett, she said, my father, who died, Gerald said, leaving you as next of kin and inheritor of his debts. His estate, Frances said. An inheritor of his estate such as it was, which included both assets and liabilities. The shop's sale covered the liabilities I was informed of. This liability was not disclosed to me at that time, which raises a question about whether it is properly enforceable against the inheritance. Gerald Coates looked at her. The pleasantness was becoming somewhat strained. That is a legal question, he said. Yes, Frances agreed. It is, and I am not in a position to answer it without access to a lawyer. There is no lawyer in Redemption Creek, Gerald said. He seemed pleased about this. There is one in Abilene, Joseph said from the corner of the room. Gerald looked at him. I can ride to Abilene, Joseph said. I do it twice a month on business. There is a very capable attorney there named Prescott who handles property law. He paused. And debt disputes. Gerald Coates was quiet for a moment. The pleasantness in his face had largely departed, and what was underneath it was not particularly attractive. That will take time, he said. Yes, Joseph agreed. It will. Frances looked at Gerald Coates and saw exactly what he was, a man who had calculated that a woman alone in a strange town was the easiest kind of mark, that the debt was probably real enough to frighten her but not solid enough to survive a legal examination, that the offer of a private supper was the opening move of something considerably uglier, and that none of this had worked because she had not been alone. I will write to Mr. Prescott this week, Frances said. If the debt is enforceable, I will make arrangements to pay it. If it is not, I trust Mr. Coates will accept that determination. Gerald Coates picked up his documents. He smiled at her once more, the smile that did not reach his eyes. I will look forward to Mr. Prescott's opinion, he said. He left. Joseph waited until the sound of his boots on the church path had faded. Then he unfolded his arms and walked to the teacher's desk where Frances was still sitting, looking at the place where Gerald Coates had been standing. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "No, I am." She stopped, pressed her hands flat on the desk surface. "I am angry," she said. "I am angry that he thinks that men like him always think." She stopped again. Joseph sat down in one of the children's pew benches across from the desk, which required him to fold himself somewhat, and he looked at her steadily. "He thinks," he said, "that a woman alone can be managed. He is wrong." "He is wrong," Frances agreed, "but the debt may be real." "Write to Prescott," Joseph said. "We will know in 2 weeks, and if it is real and enforceable, $230 is not an insurmountable amount." Frances looked at him. "Joseph, I am not going to ask you to. I know you are not going to ask me," he said. "I am telling you that it is not insurmountable. If it comes to it, we will find a way. That is all I am saying." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze with that steady, open patience that she had come to think of as one of his most fundamental qualities, this man who was not easy with words but was entirely unwavering in what he did. "All right," she said quietly. "Good," he said. He stood up, straightening himself out of the bench with the mild self-deprecation of a tall man who has just spent 5 minutes in a child's seat. "Your students are coming back," he said. Frances looked at the window. The children were crossing the churchyard in their various small groups, animated and loud in the way of children released from concentration for an hour. "Thank you," she said again. He looked at her. "I told you to stop that." "I cannot help it," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I know," he said. "You are a woman of good manners." "My father raised me to be polite," she said. "Your father," Joseph said, and there was something warm in his voice, "sounds like a man who loved his books more than his ledgers but got the important things right." Frances felt something catch in her throat. She swallowed it down because her students were coming through the door and she had long division to finish. "Yes," she said softly, "he did." Joseph Graves rode to Abilene the following week, as he had said he would, and he spoke to the attorney Prescott, as he had said he would, and he came back 2 weeks later with a letter that said, in the careful language of a man paid to be precise, that the debt as structured had some enforceability, but that the failure to disclose it at the time of the estate settlement was grounds for disputation, and that a reasonable settlement would likely be something in the range of $100 if pursued through the courts, and that Gerald Coates, upon learning that Prescott was involved, had apparently left Redemption Creek on the westbound stage. Frances read the letter twice. Then she looked at Joseph, who was standing in the kitchen doorway still dusty from the road. "He left," she said. "He left," Joseph confirmed, "because the debt would not hold." "Because the debt would not hold easily," Joseph said, "and because men like Coates choose easy." Frances set the letter down on the table. "I owe you for Prescott's time," she said. "You do not," Joseph said. "Joseph, Frances." They looked at each other across the kitchen. "I would rather owe you the amount," she said carefully, "than have you simply. You teach the children of my ranch hands," Joseph said. "Every day. For a salary that the town is supposed to pay but has not yet managed to collect from all its members. You have turned a storage room into a schoolroom. Tom's daughter reads. Hector's son can do arithmetic. You have done that in 6 weeks." He paused. "We are beyond accounts." Frances was quiet. "Besides," he said, and something in his voice went slightly different, slightly lower, slightly more careful, "I would rather talk about something other than accounts." She looked at him. He was still standing in the doorway, and he was still dusty, and he had been riding for 2 days to do something on her behalf that she had not asked him to do, and he was looking at her with those gray-blue eyes in the kitchen light with an expression that was not his usual careful restraint but was something considerably more direct. "What would you like to talk about?" she said. "You," he said. "Us. The question of what this is." Frances's heart was doing something loud and specific behind her ribs. "I think," she said, "that you may be working toward another point." "I am getting better at getting to points," he said. "You are," she agreed. He came into the kitchen then, away from the doorway, and he stood close enough that she had to look up at him. And she thought, this is it. This is the thing that has been building since that first afternoon on the platform, since she told him the truth, and he picked up her bag and walked her to the wagon. Since every lamplit supper and every look and every not quite smile and every inadequate but steady dance step, and every moment of his quiet, unwavering, particular attention. I am not good at sentiment, he said. I want to be honest about that. I know, she said, but I am also not good at pretending things are other than they are, he said. And what this is, what you are to me, he stopped, tried again. I have not felt like a man who lives in a house with the windows open, he said, for 8 years. And then you came, and you were not who I expected, and you were entirely, specifically, remarkably who you are, and the windows are open, Francis. She looked up at him, and the lamplight was between them, and outside, the Texas evening was coming down in that particular slow gold way it had in spring, and she thought about being a woman who had come west wearing a borrowed name and had somehow, impossibly, arrived at herself. Joseph, she said. Yes, he said. Kiss me, she said. Or I will have to say something equally inelegant about windows, and I would prefer not to. He laughed. It was a real laugh, full and surprised and warm, and it transformed his face entirely, and then he kissed her, and it was not at all inadequate, and the kitchen smelled of dust and cedar and something baking, and outside the Texas evening was entirely golden, and Frances Beckett put her hands against the chest of Joseph Graves and thought, there it is. They were married on the 14th of June, in the year 1883, exactly 2 months after Frances had stepped off the train at Redemption Creek Station, wearing her cousin's name on a telegram. Reverend Alderman performed the ceremony in his church, which was the same church whose back room housed Frances's school, and Frances thought there was something right about that, about being married in the same building where she had found her footing, where she had made something useful from a dusty storage room. She wore the blue wool dress, which was still too warm, but it was the best she had, and Esperanza had pressed it and done something with the collar that made it considerably more presentable. Hector stood beside Joseph. Esperanza stood beside Frances. The children from the school were there, all 12 of them, and Tom and Jesper and Red, who cried very slightly and was embarrassed about it. Dorothy Alderman was there, and this time her smile reached a bit further. The vows were the traditional ones, spoken before God and the small community of Redemption Creek, and Joseph said his in the same careful, deliberate way he said everything, as though each word had been considered and chosen specifically, and Frances said hers in a clear voice that did not shake, though she wanted it to, because she was very full of something that was almost overwhelming in its wholeness. When Reverend Alderman said, "You may kiss your bride," Joseph kissed her in the same way he had first kissed her in the kitchen, with a completeness that was entirely characteristic of him. And Hector cheered loudly and Red cheered, and the children made the various sounds children make when adults are being romantic, and it is simultaneously wonderful and slightly embarrassing. They went home to the limestone house outside of town, and it was not a spare room anymore, and the garden space to the right of the house that had been waiting for something to be planted, and it was planted now. Beans and squash and a few rows of sunflowers that Esperanza had suggested, and Frances had agreed to with enthusiasm. They sat on the porch that evening, the two of them in the 2 chairs, the one that was older and the one that was newer, in the warm dark of a Texas June, and the fireflies were starting up along the creek bank and the stars were coming out overhead. "I should write to my aunt," Frances said. "Yes," Joseph agreed, "and to Clara." "Perhaps," Joseph said, with a tone that suggested perhaps was doing significant work in that sentence. Frances looked at him. "She did not mean harm," she said. "She caused it regardless of intent," Joseph said. He was not angry. He said it as a simple fact, which was worse than anger in a way. "Yes," Frances agreed. "But she also caused this regardless of intent." She looked out at the fireflies. "I find I cannot be entirely sorry about any of it." Joseph was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand. He held it the way he did most things, firmly and without fuss, as though it were the most natural decision he had made all day. "Write to your aunt," he said. "Tell her you are well." Frances looked at their joined hands in the dark. "I am more than well," she said. "Tell her that then," Joseph said. She wrote to her aunt the next morning, a letter that was honest without being dramatic, that said simply, "I have married a good man in Texas, and I am teaching school, and I am home." She wrote a separate, shorter letter to Clara that said only, "I am well and I forgive you," which was the truth and which cost her something to write but felt right when she had written it. She did not receive a reply from Clara for a long time, and when it came, it was brief and a little awkward and somewhat defensive, which was very Clara, and Frances read it once and put it in her desk and let it be what it was. The summer passed. The school recessed in July when the heat was at its worst, and the children were needed on their families' properties. And Frances used the weeks to organize the schoolroom further, to write to a publisher in New York for textbooks, to begin a small lending library with books she sent away for using the money she had saved from her salary, which the town had finally gotten around to paying in full. She put 3 books on the shelf in the first week, and by the end of the summer there were 12, and families were coming on Saturdays to borrow them, which was something Frances had not planned but found deeply satisfying in a way she recognized from her father's shop. Joseph watched all of this with the particular quality of attention that was his way of loving things. He did not say much about it, not in direct terms, but she could see it in the way he looked at her when she was talking about a book she had ordered or a student who had surprised her, in the way he had begun to read more himself in the evenings, working his way through the Whitman on the shelf with the focused seriousness he brought to everything. "Do you like it?" she asked him one evening. She was mending. He was reading, or had been reading, and was now looking at the wall with the book open in his lap. He looked at her. "I am not certain," he said. "He is very insistent," Frances laughed. "Yes, he is. He believes everything enormously," Joseph said. "Is that a problem?" Frances asked. Joseph looked at the open page. "I think it might be the whole point," he said. "I am working on believing that." Frances set down her mending and looked at her husband in the lamplight, this man who had been shut up with his grief for 8 years and was learning, with the focused, deliberate effort he brought to everything, to believe things enormously again. "You are doing well," she said. "I have a good teacher," he said. In September, the school reopened with 15 children. 3 new families had come to Redemption Creek over the summer, drawn by the railway and the rangeland, and each of them had children, and word had apparently traveled that there was a real school now, with books and a teacher who took it seriously. Frances hired an assistant. She hired Red, whose full name was Robert Callahan and who was, she had discovered over the summer, an entirely capable reader who had educated himself largely from the books Frances had been adding to the schoolroom, and who was quietly devoted to Margaret, who was 13 and would need to be in Abilene in a year for proper secondary schooling, and whose father Tom was already saving for it. Red came to teach reading to the younger children 3 mornings a week, and Frances paid him from her own salary, which Joseph did not comment on except to say that he would match it, which she argued with briefly and then accepted because it was a practical solution, and she was learning to accept his practical solutions with less resistance than she had originally applied. She was 25. He was 34. They had been married for 3 months, and she could not have told you the precise moment she had gone from thinking him a practical stranger to thinking him the person she oriented toward the way a compass orients, reflexively, and without having to decide to do so. In October, she realized she was expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday morning before he went out to see to the cattle, because she had decided that waiting was pointless and that he deserved to know as soon as she knew. He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that with anyone else would have frightened her. Then he looked at her, and his face had done the thing it sometimes did when he was most moved by something, that particular quality of stillness that was not absence but presence at a very deep level, as though everything in him had moved toward a central point. "Francis," he said. "Yes," she said. "You are certain." "Reasonably," she said. "Esperanza confirmed it yesterday." He looked at her for another moment. Then he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in his hands, and he kissed her forehead with a tenderness that was so complete and so unlike his usual careful restraint that it undid her entirely, and she pressed her face against his chest and breathed in the smell of him, wool and cedar and dust, and this specific particular person who was hers. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed from against his chest. His arms came around her. Outside, the morning light was coming in through the kitchen windows, and the garden had the final scraggly remnants of the summer growing in it, and the schoolroom was waiting for her in town, and Redemption Creek was going about its Tuesday morning business, and Frances Beckett Graves stood in her kitchen in her husband's arms and felt the whole enormous weight of a future she had not planned pressing warm and certain against her like sunlight. The winter came, which in Redemption Creek was not the brutal thing it was further north, but was its own kind of hardship, cold nights and dry wind and occasional ice on the creek. And Frances was large with the baby by February, and running the school from a seated position of some dignity and considerable discomfort. And Joseph was solicitous in the particular way that was his way of being solicitous, appearing with warm things and fetching what she needed and saying very little about any of it. Which was exactly right. Esperanza came in March when it was time. The labor was long, which Esperanza said was normal, and Joseph spent it in the barn because Esperanza sent him there, which Frances was not entirely certain was medically necessary, but appreciated nonetheless, because she was not sure she could have maintained her composure if he had been present, and composure felt important. The baby arrived in the early hours of a Wednesday morning in March of 1884, and he was a boy, which made Joseph's face do something that Frances thought he would have been embarrassed about if he had known she was watching. They named him William, for Frances's father. William Graves, named for a man who had loved books and left debts and gotten the important things right, which Frances thought was an entirely adequate legacy to bring into a limestone house in Texas. Hector and Esperanza came to see him. Hector held William with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before, and said that the boy had good strong hands, which was the quality Hector apparently considered most important in a person. Esperanza said he had his mother's eyes, which were brown and clear, and his father's expression, which was watchful and serious. "He is going to be exactly like Joseph," Esperanza said. "God help him," Joseph said, which made everyone laugh, including Joseph himself. The school continued. Frances returned to it when William was 6 weeks old, with William in a basket behind the teacher's desk, which the children thought was wonderful and which required some firm management of the impulse to abandon lessons and look at the baby. Red continued his 3 mornings a week. Margaret, who was 14 now and brilliant, took over reading instruction for the youngest children entirely and was better at it than anyone else in the room, including Frances. Tom sent Margaret to Abilene in the autumn of that year. She went with an armful of books from the schoolroom library, her slate, and a letter of recommendation from Frances that described her as the finest natural teacher she had ever encountered. Margaret cried when she left. Red did not cry this time, but he watched the stage leave from the street with an expression that Frances decided not to comment on. 2 years later, in the autumn of 1886, Red followed Margaret to Abilene. He had saved his money, and he had a position as a stock handler in Abilene, and he had written to Margaret with a formal propriety that was charming and asked her to consider him, and she had apparently considered him favorably. Frances attended their wedding the following spring, driving to Abilene with Joseph and William, who was 3 years old and had his father's eyes and his mother's complete inability to tolerate unfair situations, which was already very apparent in a child of 3. Frances stood at the back of the small church in Abilene and watched Red and Margaret say their vows and thought about circles and how they close, and felt Joseph's hand find hers and close around it. Redemption Creek grew in those years. The railway brought commerce, and the commerce brought people, and the people brought children. And by 1887 Francis's school had 22 students and needed a second proper classroom. She wrote a petition to the town council, which now existed in a more formal sense than it had when she arrived, and she presented it herself at the council meeting, and Joseph sat in the back row of the meeting hall and watched her do it with that particular steady expression, and the council approved the expansion unanimously. The expansion was built onto the back of the church with lumber from Abilene and labor from half the ranches in the county, because Redemption Creek had by now absorbed Francis's school as one of the things that made it Redemption Creek, one of the things it was proud of. Red and Margaret's wedding had brought people back who had been at Redemption Creek when it was a rougher, smaller thing, and they had seen what it was now, and they said it was the school that had done it, the sense of something being built for the future. Francis did not take credit for this. She said it was the community that had done it, which was true. But Joseph, who knew her better than anyone except possibly Esperanza, told her privately that she was the one who had made the community believe it was the kind of place that had a future worth building toward, and that this was not a small thing. William turned 4 and then 5 and then started school, which was peculiar in the way that things are peculiar when they are also exactly right. Teaching your own son alongside other people's children, watching him approach knowledge with the focused intensity that was entirely his father and the specific enthusiasm that was entirely her father's legacy come around again. He loved books immediately and completely. Francis found him one morning before school, sitting on the porch steps with a copy of Robinson Crusoe open across his small knees, working through the words with the laborious determination of a child who has just discovered that he can do this, that these marks mean something, that the page is not a wall but a door. She sat down beside him and helped him with the difficult words, and the morning light was on the porch, and the garden was coming up green, and inside she could hear Joseph in the kitchen, the sounds of a morning that was ordinary in all the particular specific ways that ordinary becomes, over time, the most precious thing. In 1888 they had a second child. A girl this time named Sarah, for the woman Joseph had loved and lost and carried quietly for 8 years, until a woman in a blue wool dress arrived on a platform wearing a borrowed name and opened all the windows. He wept when they told him it was a girl and that they had named her Sarah. He wept briefly and without apparent self-consciousness, which was not characteristic, and Francis held his hand and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying, and the baby made the sounds that new babies make, and William stood in the doorway looking at his sister with the expression of a 5-year-old encountering something completely new and uncertain how to categorize it. "She is very small," William said. "You were also very small," Francis told him. "Was I?" He seemed to find this difficult to believe. "You were," Joseph said from beside the bed, his voice still a little rough. "And you grew." William looked at his sister for another moment. "All right," he said, with the pragmatic acceptance of a child who has decided a thing and moved on. He came into the room and stood next to his father and looked at the baby. "Hello, Sarah," he said in the careful, deliberate tone of his father. "I am your brother William. I will help." Francis looked at her son, and at her husband, and at the new baby sleeping in her arms, and out the window the April morning was very bright. She thought about a telegram and a train and a platform and $3.40, and a woman who had nothing left in St. Louis worth staying for. She thought about open windows. She thought about her father, who had gotten the important things right. She thought about Hector Ruiz and his advertisement, and the strange, impossible chain of accidents and choices and cowardices and braveries that had brought her to this limestone house on a Tuesday morning in April of 1888, with a 5-year-old son and a newborn daughter and a husband who was not good at sentiment but who had stood in a kitchen doorway one evening and told her that the windows were open. "Joseph," she said. He looked at her. "I am glad," she said, "that Hector placed that advertisement." The corner of his mouth moved, more than it usually moved, a full smile, the kind that reached his eyes and changed his whole face. "So am I," he said. Outside, Redemption Creek was going about its morning business. In the schoolroom at the back of the church, Red was teaching reading to the youngest children, filling in for Frances in her absence with the confidence of a man who has been doing this long enough to know he is good at it. Esperanza had arrived at the house and was in the kitchen doing things that involved the competent management of breakfast. Hector was in the barn with Joseph's cattle, doing what he had done for 11 years, keeping the operation running with quiet expertise. William had gone to find him, which was his favorite morning activity. The world was very ordinary and very specific and very full. Frances looked down at her daughter, who was sleeping with the absolute commitment of the newly arrived. Sarah, she thought. Sarah Graves, named for what came before and carrying it forward the way living things carry things forward, by being alive, by growing, by becoming. She thought there was a school to run. There were children waiting for books and arithmetic, and the particular pleasure of understanding that the world was explicable, that it had logic and beauty, and that both of these things were available to anyone willing to look. She thought there was a husband she loved in ways she had not known how to love when she stepped off a train in April of 1883, ways that had nothing to do with romance as she had read about it in her father's books, but everything to do with the real, lived, daily practice of choosing someone and being chosen back, of building something together from the particular materials of who you each were. She thought there was a life here, a full and specific life, in this limestone house in this small Texas town under this enormous sky, a life she had not planned and could not have imagined and would not trade for any deliberate thing she might have chosen on purpose. She thought about her father, about how he had said that the best books found you. She thought about a yellow telegram folded in a coat pocket on a westbound train. She thought, yes, that is exactly right. In the years that followed, William grew into a serious, good-natured boy with a gift for language and an interest in law, which surprised no one who had seen him at 5 standing in a doorway saying, "Hello, Sarah, I am your brother William, I will help." He went to school in Abilene at 14 and wrote letters home every week without fail, detailed and precise letters that Frances saved in a box in her desk. And Joseph answered every one of them in his careful, deliberate handwriting that had not changed since the day he first signed the register at Redemption Creek's church. Sarah grew into someone quite different, quick and physical and interested in the ranch in ways that William had never been, following Hector everywhere from the time she could walk, learning the cattle and the land with an ease that made Hector say she had the blood of this country in her, which he meant as the highest possible compliment. The school continued to grow. By 1890 there were 2 full classrooms and a 3rd teacher, a young woman named Alma who had come down from Dallas with her father's family and had a degree from a teacher's college in Austin. Frances and Alma developed a friendship that was brisk and genuine and mutually respectful, the friendship of 2 women who are both good at the same thing and have the sense to recognize it. Hector and Esperanza's children grew, and one of them, their eldest son Miguel, became one of Frances's best students and went eventually to the University of Texas when it opened properly, which was a thing that made Hector cry openly and without any attempt at concealment, sitting in the wagon outside the station in Abilene, and which made Joseph shake his hand for a very long time. Dorothy Alderman apologized to Frances in 1889 for the conversation at the first dance. Frances said there was nothing to apologize for, which was mostly true. Dorothy said there was, and she was sorry. Frances thought about it and decided that accepting the apology honestly was better than dismissing it, and said thank you, Dorothy, and meant it. Reverend Alderman retired in 1891, and a new minister came, a younger man who brought his wife and 3 children and immediately enrolled all 3 in Francis's school, and who said to Francis on his first Sunday in Redemption Creek that he had heard the school was the finest thing about the town, and he could see that it was true. Francis thought about what Joseph had said, about the community believing it was the kind of place with a future worth building toward. She thought about how a thing like that starts, how it starts with someone deciding to take a storage room in hand, with someone believing that the children of a small Texas town were worth the best that could be given them, with someone arriving by accident wearing a borrowed name and finding, in the accident, the very specific shape of themselves. In the spring of 1892, Francis and Joseph sat on their porch in the evening light as they had so many evenings, the older chair and the newer chair, the garden full and green, the creek audible in the distance if you listened, William's letters in the house and Sarah's boots by the door, the limestone walls warm from the day's sun. Joseph was reading. He had become, over 9 years, a genuine reader, which had not been entirely true when she arrived and found Middlemarch sitting slightly apart on his bookshelf. He read slowly and with the same deliberate focus he brought to everything, and he retained what he read in a way that made him, occasionally, startling to talk to. Francis was not reading. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, looking at the last of the light on the hills, the cedar hills going blue the way they always did at this hour, the sky doing its slow progression from gold to rose to the deep clear dark that preceded the stars. She had been thinking about Clara. She had received a letter from Clara the previous week, the latest in a sporadic correspondence that had accumulated over 9 years into something that was almost, though not quite, a genuine connection. Clara was happy, apparently. Thomas was a banker in Memphis. They had 2 children. Clara was involved in charitable work of the organizing kind, which suited her, which Francis thought she said generously and meant honestly. The letter had said at the end in Clara's looping handwriting, "I often think about what I did, Francis. The telegram. I know I never properly said that I am sorry. I am. I was a coward and I was selfish, and I did not think about what it would mean for you or for Mr. Graves. I have thought about it often since. I hope you know I think of it with shame." Francis had read the letter twice and thought about it for 3 days and then thought about it again now in the evening light. "Joseph," she said. He said without looking up from his book. Clara wrote. He looked up. "She apologized," Francis said, "properly." He considered this. And I think I should write back and tell her that it is truly forgiven," Francis said. "Not just accepted, truly forgiven." Because she paused, watched the light change on the hills. "Because I have everything," she said simply. "And I would not have it if she had not been a coward at exactly the right moment." Joseph looked at her for a long moment. Then he set his book on his knee and reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, as he had done hundreds of times over 9 years, with that same quality of choice in it, of this being a thing he did because he had decided to do it and would go on deciding. "Write to her," he said. "I will," Francis said. She looked at their joined hands in the evening light, his broad and sundark and familiar, her smaller and holding on. She thought about a train, about a platform, about $3.40 and nowhere on earth worth going back to. She thought about a man who picked up her bag and said the wagon is around the side, and a kitchen table and lamplight, and a not quite smile, and a man who danced inadequately but steadily. She thought about a storage room made into a schoolroom, made into a life, made into this. This porch, this evening, this hand in hers, this life that had grown up around her like the garden she had planted in the turned earth to the right of the house, deliberately and with care, and from seeds she had chosen, but also bigger and more various and more full of color than she had known to plan for. The stars were coming out overhead. Joseph was watching the sky too now, his book forgotten. "William's letter said he is coming home for the summer," Francis said. "I know," Joseph said. "I read it. Sarah will be happy," Francis said. "Sarah will boss him around within an hour of his arrival," Joseph said. "She always does." He does not seem to mind. No, Joseph agreed. He does not. The creek said something in the distance, and the fireflies were starting up along its bank, and somewhere in the house Esperanza was finishing in the kitchen before she went home to Hector, and somewhere beyond the cedar hills the enormous Texas dark was assembling itself for the night. Frances Beckett Graves sat on her porch in the spring of 1892 and held her husband's hand and breathed in the warm, cedar-scented air of a place she had come to by accident and chosen to stay in on purpose, and she thought, this is it. This is the whole of it. Not a story in one of my father's books, not a thing observed from outside, but a thing she was inside, a thing she was made of, a thing that was hers. The stars came fully out. Joseph turned to look at her in the dark with that expression she had been collecting for 9 years, the one that was not his careful restraint but the thing underneath it, the thing that lived in the open windows, the thing he had learned with focused, deliberate effort to let out into the light. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said everything he meant, completely, plainly and without decoration, as a fact of the world. "I love you," Frances said back. The night settled over Redemption Creek like something gentle and certain, and the stars were enormously, specifically, beautifully themselves, and the limestone house was warm behind them, and the life they had built was all around them, and it was not a spare room anymore, and the shutters were open, and had been for a long time now. It was exactly enough. It was, in every possible particular, exactly and completely more than enough.